Welcome to the Clearly Christian Podcast with Dr. Cy Smith. It's time to know more so you can say no more. It's time for the Clearly Christian Podcast. Here's your host, Dr. Cy Smith.
I'm Dr. Cy Smith, and this is Clearly Christian, a podcast about what it means to see the world from God's perspective and the impact this has on training the next generation to live a life consistent with a biblical worldview. Thanks for listening. And if you like the show and you've been listening for a while, I'd encourage you to hit the subscribe button or leave a review, and that will let others know that the show's worth listening to and certainly help us advance the cause of Christian education. Today, we're talking about money, specifically how private Christian schools are funded and the significance of capital campaigns. Financially, private schools function completely different than public schools, and there's great attention given to both the market and fundraising. And even though they're nonprofit, they operate much like a business, always trying to create value for their customers and demand for their service. More than ever before, private school leaders must learn to think like business owners, which is a major paradigm shift for professional educators such as myself. This shift is changing the culture of private school funding and the role of the CEO. And it's something I'm very familiar with, having led Mansfield Christian School for over 3 decades and having worked with multiple Christian school leaders across varied organizations, such as ACSI and the Ohio Christian Education Network. So today, I'll be the guest, so to speak, and I'll be joined by the show's producer, Bryan Lefelhoc, who has several questions about private school funding and capital campaigns. So, Bryan, welcome.
Hi, Cy. How you doing?
I am fine, sir. Thank you very much.
This is a unique approach to the show. You're actually the guest today.
I am. Yeah, it's exciting. I don't mind that at all.
It's because you have a lot of experience with this capital campaigns and giving, and I think you have a bigger picture understanding of why it's good for the world and the community, and so I'm excited to ask some questions about that.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
So can you explain a little bit? You just mentioned that it's very different than public schools. Can you explain how it's different? And let most people like me that don't get it. How does this work?
Yeah, and it's a whole different mindset in the sense that, and we are learning this in Christian education even more and more and more, and that you are really 3 things. You're an educational institution, of course, because academic training is what you do. And then you're a ministry in many ways, right? You have a mission that is specific. That's why you're a private school. So you have a purpose. And so you're very ministry minded in some ways, like a church in that sense. And that's why you're a nonprofit, right? You're a ministry. Even the government recognizes that. But you're also a business. And so there is a bottom line. And like I said, you're a nonprofit, so you're not raking in hundreds of thousands of dollars every year. But you also can't be in the red either and finish not at least breaking even or have some in the black. So balancing those 3 things is very challenging in all nonprofits, but especially in a nonprofit like education where you're servicing people through something like a school. And private schools then rely, of course, on tuition. So for all of us, it's going to be tuition's going to fund anywhere from 65, 70% to upwards of almost 90% of your budget. And so most of us have millions of dollars in budget, and it could be anywhere from 65 to 90% of that is tuition. But listen, 98% of the schools in this country, private schools, rely on other sources beyond tuition to actually accomplish what they need. Tuition rarely, we like to talk about being tuition driven, and we'd all love to be tuition driven. Say, you know what, the tuition just pays for everything we need. It's not possible. Unless you're charging just some exorbitant amount. But like I said, the research shows even the really prestigious boarding schools on the East Coast that have, they're charging $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 a year at the K-12 level. I mean, these schools are charging even over what private colleges are. Even they rely on funding outside of tuition to make it work. And so we all do. And so we're very blessed in Ohio that we do get a substantial amount, and a substantial, you might get 8 to 10% of your budget will come from the state of Ohio through things like auxiliary services program, administrative cost reimbursement. I mean, there's some government programs that we're able to be a part of in the state of Ohio that come with no strings attached money, that the state says, because we make you do these things as an accredited school, we will help you pay for them. Well, that's very, very gracious, obviously, because in a lot of states that doesn't happen. The state doesn't give those private schools any money. They make them do things and they don't help fund them. So we're very blessed in Ohio that the state comes along and says some of those things. And then, of course, you're going to have fundraising to make up some of that difference as well. The hard part is and I'll speak to this as we go further, but when you rely on fundraising to bridge that gap between what you need and what is coming in for tuition, that's when it gets really tough to run a business.
Yeah, so then let's go ahead and talk about that. Because in your budget, you have to anticipate some level of fundraising, and then you get into a capital campaign where you're trying to do more and different and new things. How do you set that budget up in the first place, and how do you count on the support of the community to kind of bridge that gap?
Yeah, it's a great question, and Christian school administrators have been struggling with that for years. And you really can't count on hundreds of thousands of dollars in fundraising, right? It's too volatile. And I tell our board and I tell CEOs all the time, listen, and a lot of times it'll depend on people like me and advancement directors and school superintendents to go out there and do that. Well, what if something happens to those of us in that role, right? I mean, the school joke is, what if I step out of the school and get hit by a bus, right? That's what school people say that all the time. And well, what if the advancement director, up and leaves and things like that? And so the people in charge of raising money for some reason can't get it done that year. Does that mean your budget is going to completely fall apart? It could if that's the way you're set up. So you don't want to set up a budget that is hundreds of thousands of dollars short, and it depends on events, fundraising events, or depends on even one-on-one relationships with someone. So as much as we possibly can, you'll use the tuition money and other sources of hard revenue. We call them levers, other levers of revenue to come in to help you make budget. And then anything you raise is above and beyond. So use that money then for capital improvements, use it for programming, use it for even personnel, whatever else you need. Keep those essential things, maybe even or extra things outside of the budget so that you can use fundraising dollars for some of those extras, not necessarily to make the budget.
And then, so what's the argument for the extras? You mentioned that you have to have it, and you have to be able to support, and you have to do the things that tuition doesn't cover for. I know in public schools, when you can't make it, or when your costs exceed your revenue, you just ask for a levy, and you ask for support, and if 50% of it says yes, then you have enough to use. But in your world, what's the impetus? What would you miss if you weren't able to cover that gap? What would you lose? Because you just can't ask for a levy to pass.
Right, exactly. And that's a great point. And sometimes we worry that we're kind of wearing out our customer because they're paying tuition, and then you're always asking for more, right? But you're trying to communicate that we're trying to make it better all of the time. So, you're a business, right? And so just like your own business, you're thinking, hey, it's going to cost me money to make it better. And I'm forever preaching, excellence is one of our core values, and you got to make it better next year than it was this year. And so the team will come back to me and say, well, I can make it better, but I'm going to need more resources. I'm going to need more funding. I'm going to need more personnel. I'm going to need more computers, more tech, more this, more that. Well, how do you fund that? Well, if it's not able to be funded in the essential budget, then you're going to have to go out and get those extras like we just talked about, and you're going to have to fundraise for some of those extras. And that's what I've been able to do the last, 10, 15, 20 years is say, you know what, we need a media production program. We need a STEM program. We need to pay our teachers better. We need to do some of those things. So above and beyond the budget, then I'll go out and fundraise for those things and then put them in place, create a financial sustainability program to weave them into the budget over time. But a lot of things have to make sense for those things to be added in. But you do have to go out and get those dollars, and you try to get them from outside of your normal customer.
And I want to talk about the normal customer in a second, too, because there's taxpayers, everyone's a taxpayer to the public schools, and then there's those that send their kids to private or Christian schools. First, I'm interested, though, in you were talking about wearing out your customers. Does it ever feel awkward to ask? I mean, you're constantly kind of asking, right? I know you're trying to support and further your mission, but you're still, quote unquote, begging for more. Does that ever become hard for you to do? Or does the mission
It
support
certainly
your
was. Yeah, great point. It certainly was at the beginning, and very awkward because you're feeling like that a lot of these families are tapped out already. They're paying their property taxes to support their local public school. Then they're paying tuition on top of this, and then you're asking for even above and beyond that. So the more I do it, the easier it gets, for sure. But you're always trying to communicate that. And I said this or implied this certainly at the beginning. Listen, they have to understand how expensive education is. It is one of the most costliest endeavors out there, and one of the most costly business, because you think about all the things that we have to spend money on, right? The facilities, the resources, like I said, the technology, the personnel, the student resources that they need, the desk, the furniture, the equipment, the Chromebooks, the expenses never end. I mean, the mowers for the maintenance department, the lights for the gym. I mean, it's far greater than what a lot of businesses have that are working with these limited numbers. I mean, you might say, well, this huge manufacturing company has a lot of expenses like yours. Yeah, and they also have a $50 million budget, and they're traded globally. That's no school, right? So they look completely different, and they're not necessarily relying on certainly tuition. So it's just very, very expensive. So you're constantly trying to communicate that message to your people to say, listen, I know you've got a lot of skin in the game, but these costs are big, and if you'll get on board, we will make sure that it comes back to you in the form of value added for your child.
And so you've been doing this a long time. I'm interested. What's the pushback when someone says, Si, you've asked a few times, and I've been happy to support. Here's why I'm kind of on the fence. What are typically the reasons that someone says, maybe not?
Yeah. Sometimes it's just as simple as, I've run that stretch already. I'm tapped out, or I'm giving to another organization, things like that. In the fundraising advancement world, you always try to be in the top 3 of people's giving strategies. And so, it might include the church, might be number 1. You don't know. A lot of times they'll support other charitable causes, other nonprofits, but you always try to have your school be in that top 3. Well, a lot of times that's true while they are a very involved parent, but once they're not a very involved parent anymore and their child graduates, then we usually lose those dollars. And so you usually just see the natural attrition of family interest is really peaks, and then it declines, and their money goes with it.
And I think a lot of people through different reasons. I've had some experience in the public schools as a school board member, and we've done a few levies. And one of the hardest things to do, and it's understandable, a senior citizen who no longer has kids in the system, typically is not all that excited about passing a levy for new buildings or things of that sort. And I get it. We don't go there to school anymore. I don't go to that school. I'm not going to support that school. I understand it. I don't think it's right, but I understand it. In your world, if I don't send my kids to public or to private Christian schools, what's the argument for me to help support your schools? Your schools is a community school. It's a community initiative. Just because it's private doesn't mean it doesn't affect the community. So I should be involved. But, my kids don't go there. So don't knock on my door. Right? How do you overcome that? Because I know you need everyone. You need more support.
Right. Yep, that's a great question, and you hit it right on the head. You've got to convince these people that this is the best thing for the community. You've got to convince them that, like a school in our case, we're going to be over 900 kids this fall. That's 900 kids in Richland County, obviously, and there's 150 employees. Like I said, multi-million-dollar budget. The government would define us as a medium-size, business. This is not a mom-and-pop shop over here. So you have to convince the general community that a school like yours or Mansfield Christian School, this private school, is good for the local area in that you can attract people to your county. You can attract the right kind of people to your county, good Christian citizens that are going to be a win for this area. And you really want to see, I tell people all the time, listen, when you move to Columbus or, Cuyahoga County, some of these other, metropolitan areas in Ohio, they know that moving there because of the size of the population, I'm going to have a number of good school choices, both public and private. All right. It could be Catholic schools, Protestant schools, public schools, doesn't matter. They just know that, hey, if I move to Columbus, I'm probably going to have at least half a dozen to a dozen really good school options depending on my convictions. Well, we have to have that same thing in Richland County. We have to have people moving into our county and all counties, right? That
wherever
say,
it's happening.
wherever it's happening, right? That say, I can move there, and no matter what my convictions are, I have really good school options. And people then, to your point, the people that you referred to, they have to recognize that, when Mansfield Christian succeeds and gets better, as long as they are a really good, viable option, that's just good for all the boats here, right? This rising tide lifts all boats. That is good for everyone, and that will attract people. And we think, of course, we're in a great spot here, close to 71. We love that Columbus seems to be moving north this direction, so we're super happy about that. But we know, we're already hearing from some of our people that have moved in, saying, hey, we moved here because we wanted to get away from maybe the big city, and we love that there's an A-plus Christian school in our backyard that is very, very drivable, less than 30 minutes away. So that's really what we're reaching out to the community and saying, hey, if you've got some extra, or if you've got some means, or even if you've just got some conviction to say, you know what, I already got my property taxes going someplace else, but I can help the kids of tomorrow by investing in a Christian education, and they're going to need it because they don't have any other resource other than the generosity of the community. So I'm going to go ahead and put some money over there too.
Yeah, and that leads me into my next question. We talk a lot about, and I've been working with you on the show for quite a while, you talk about helping to make sure that the future looks bright, that these kids are ready to take on the challenges and to kind of turn things around, and that a Christian education can make that happen. That's the mission. You talked about the fundraising and campaign dollars, capital campaign dollars, bridging the gap. Why does there always have to be a gap? Like, why do Christian schools need to grow? Why do they need to expand? Why do they need to become better? Can't we just stay where we are so you don't have to raise so much money? And I have a feeling that has to do with mission, but can you talk a little bit about kind of why that's so important?
Yeah, exactly. And we like to say around here, we were designed for kingdom impact. And so we really believe, and I think it's true, when these schools get bigger and better, the culture gets bigger and better. In other words, you and I would believe, and I think our listeners, we need more Christians. We need more people out there in society who have a biblical worldview, who see things from God's perspective, what this show is all designed to get. And so the more graduates we have, the better off our community is, Mansfield is, Christian schools are, obviously, Richland County, the state of Ohio, the country, more people knowing right from wrong, willing to take a stand and say, this is really where we need to go. And we need more of these kids leading the culture, more of these kids who can defend the faith, more of these kids who know how to, this is a key when I try to tell these business owners, more kids who know how to integrate their faith with work. They've never heard anything like that in any other school setting, right? I mean, you'll go kindergarten through college and you've never been trained to any kind of way academically. Your mind is an amazing thing, right? To think about how this job aligns with your faith. Most people have those things in a box. My faith is over here. My job is over here. And I've never thought about how these two mix unless I go into ministry. Well, guess what? That's what we do in Christian schools. We say, hey, look to see how God has wired you as a child and a young person and then a young adult. And what is he calling you to do? Why do you want to be a doctor, a lawyer, a broadcast producer, right? Anything else? And how is that aligned then with what your purpose is on this earth? In other words, why did God make you? How can I serve the Lord? How can I serve others? What is this job all about? And it doesn't matter if you're picking up trash or you're the president of the country or president of a company. All of these things can be used for God's glory if you know the purpose, right? Why you were created and you know why you're doing what you're doing. So we train them to think like that, and they can be leaders then on their job. And so this idea of leading the culture and having impact, because this is really why we were put on this earth anyway, right, is to be into relationship with God and relationship with each other. And part of that is building culture and making it work the way it was supposed to work, right? You know why it doesn't work? Because of sin. Sin ruined everything, right? It's ruined every one of our lives, and it's ruined everything that ever exists since the beginning of time. But that wasn't how it was meant to be. Right? He didn't create the world with sin. Sin came into the world because of, our fallen nature. And so we're trying to get back to that original state to say, listen, this is what God really had intended for you. And so how do we integrate that? Help lead humanity back to its original purpose.
Okay, so let me push back just a little bit, because if all of that is what's important, and it is, then why do you need the nice gymnasium? Why do you need the media class? Like, if we're just here to make sure that students are ready to take on the world with a biblical perspective, aren't you building your own gap that you're trying to fill? Of course, that's a devil's advocate question, but you know where I'm going.
Right, exactly, right. Yeah, we definitely want to make sure that obviously that educational experience, and this is maybe goes back to what I said from the outset, we're an educational institution, a business, and a ministry, right? And so again, all those things have to work together. So like every other school, we have to train the whole child, and we want you to have those experiences that are going to mature you into the person that God wants you to be. And he may want you to be an athlete. And so we've got to help you figure that out and help you understand athletics from God's perspective. Those are such valuable experiences, right? And we have more and more kids now going into media production fields and STEM fields, and they are saying, man, I am so thankful that we started those programs at MCS because I determined or discovered God's calling for my life because of a program that we implemented. So we have to be responding to those kinds of things. And like I said, it can even be a club, right? It can be a total extracurricular, the Spanish club, the chess club, the whatever club, the robotics club. That may be really where it lights your fire and you find your passion. And we say, yep, you know what? This is how the Lord's created you. The fine arts are another good example, that your love for instruments or painting or sculpting. And you think, man, the Lord's really given me a passion for this and a talent. How can I use this for his glory? And maybe it's going to be your job and how you make money, or maybe it's just going to be something you do on the side. But we want to walk with you there and help you figure that out.
In one of the recent episodes of the Clearly Christian podcast, we talked about for-profit business, and I can't remember who the guest was, but we talked about the difference between for-profit and nonprofit and how that's just a tax designation. People expect for-profit businesses to rake as much as they can in. But nonprofits typically kind of sell themselves short, don't they, a little bit? I need just enough to keep the lights on. And it won't work that way in Christian education. It probably shouldn't work that way in a regular nonprofit. How do you advise folks, as far as leading campaigns and running nonprofit organizations and schools to kind of shoot for the nonprofit or the profit mentality and go for big? Talk about that a little bit.
Right. That is becoming a legitimate concern now. As a matter of fact, ACSI asked me several months ago, now, hey, could you do a Zoom on this very thing that you just said?
Really?
Because we are seeing this is a need that our people have. Understanding that, yep, you may call yourself a nonprofit, but you do need to make a profit. You are running a nonprofit designed to create some sort of surplus. And if you see yourself as I'm just trying to break even and not lose too much money, that's a terrible way to do business, right? No company would ever say you're going to be successful. You must have some surplus to invest in the company to make it better. And so what we immediately do, unlike a company, and here's where we would be different in the nonprofit world, is if you see you're going to finish in the black and significantly so, you're immediately, not later, not 3 years down the road, we're going to amass, let's say I'm going to finish the year $500,000 in the black. I'm going to let that ride for the next 5 or 10 years so that I can amass that. That would probably never happen in nonprofit. You would immediately reinvest that into your company, even if it's hiring new people or personnel to say, how do we make this better? And so you'll immediately spend your profits down. You won't pad the coffers of the CEO. You won't, he's not going to be buying an airplane anytime soon. I'm not doing that kind of stuff, right? You're not, taking that money and investing it in someplace else so that it'll grow. Another business might say, well, we had such a great year. We took that money, $500,000, invested in another company so it would grow. No, we're not going to do that. We're going to immediately turn around and say, how do we make this company better? But yeah, you do have to have that mindset now to say, no, those days are over. For you to get better, you reinvest those profits, and you must make a profit every year. And so you never take your foot off the gas. We're blessed in Ohio that most of us are experiencing enrollment growth due to vouchers and culture and COVID and all those things merged together to give us some better surplus these days, but we're immediately saying, all right, we gotta spend this to make it better. Whether that's building a building or hiring new staff, you're going to need to reinvest and get better.
Saya, you talked before about feeling comfortable now. I think people are wired to give. You go back to your fallen nature. I think, in sin we keep. When we're acting the way we should be, we give. What are some stories? What are some feelings that people have when you're successful in generating support and buy-in? Like, what makes you feel good? What makes you sleep well at night, knowing that you helped me to realize my potential by encouraging me to give? Do you have some stories or things to share that even other people that are maybe in your position trying to raise money aren't quite as good at it as you might be? Help me feel good about asking. What's on the other side?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. You're always trying to connect with people emotionally. When people get connected emotionally, then that really moves the needle. In other words, you can go after them mentally, and that's a great place to start. But until it moves those 18 inches from your head down to your heart, you tend not to get that check. And but you need to start somewhere, right? So you need to talk with them about mentally why this is a good investment. And that's really what you're talking about, is an investment, right? You're not just giving money away. And people want to know, what's my ROI? What's my return on investment, right? People with capital, or even with the widow's mite, as it says in scriptures, even with the smallest little amount, $50 a month or something like that. This is what I have in proportion to my wealth. Even that's fine. But why should I give it to you? Why am I investing in what we like to say, investing in eternity, right? Because it's the eternal souls and the salvation of these kids, where they're going to spend, the rest of their lives, and even long after they've passed. And so we're forever preaching that. But probably the best example I had that locally was a gentleman who he'd heard that message for years and years. I went out and visited him. He was a corporate owner, a local CEO. I had made probably 10 visits to his office, no more than once or twice a year, and really talking with him about why MCS was good for the community. He never sent any of his children to MCS. His grandchildren didn't go to MCS, but he had some means, and he was, like I said, a local business owner. And mentally, he really agreed. He would say, yep, it's good for Mansfield Christian. As a business owner, I get it. We don't want to see this school go under. And so he would give me a small amount, anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000 a year, probably, interest off of an investment or something like that. But at least to say, here, let me help you. Well, I started squirreling that money away, and saying that, this seems to be very reliable. So I started banking that in another little small fund. And then eventually that, fund got up to approaching about $100,000, and I was able to renovate a room. And so one time I told him about that, and he was like, wow, that's my favorite subject. I'm so glad you renovated that room. And so I think, then that helped to get him a little bit more on board that, wow, I did something significant for that school. And then one year I visited him as well, and he asked to talk to me, which was unusual. And we spent about an hour and a half in his office talking. And he had lots and lots of questions for me about the state of their culture and education. And I could tell at this point, like I said, he was well into his 80s. He was really reflecting on what's important in life. And he wanted to do something significant, but he was really seeing that, wow, I can't believe how far we've come as a culture. And he really wanted to know, what did we believe and why we believed it? And when I told him that this is a school that stands for right and wrong, and I told him what biblical truth was and what our convictions were and how we differ from every other school, he said, that's something I want to invest in. And he said, in 2 weeks, you'll have a check for $1 million. Let's get started on some of those capital campaigns. Well, I'm tearing up practically. I give him a big hug. It is a wonderful moment, the most significant, donation the school has ever received in its 60-plus year history. And it really changed the course of my career from being more of an academic CEO to now a business CEO, because at that point we were able to put into motion some of the capital campaign and then really start to think, okay, when you get a transformational gift like that, then let's start transforming this organization. So again, moving from the head to the heart, that's a great, great thing to experience.
It's interesting that you're doing the right things with even the smaller amounts of money. I'm sure some people give much less than that, $100,
Yes.
$200. You're doing the right things, and people have to know that, don't they? So that someday those larger gifts can make such a a big difference. And I imagine misusing the money is a huge mistake. What are other kind of mistakes? Maybe I know there's a lot of school leaders watching this podcast. We know that. What might they want to look for if they're in the midst of their beginning campaigns and things of that sort, or maybe some things that you wish you'd have known then back when you were younger as far as raising dollars? What can you teach them?
Yeah. I tell schools right away, number one, make sure you have someone on staff dedicated to this cause. If you don't have someone whose job it is primarily to do this, especially if you're going to launch a multi-million-dollar capital campaign, then you're not going to succeed. And it can be the CEO, or it can be an advancement director or something like that. But if somebody's job is not dedicated to that, it just isn't going to work. You'll always find things to do that are easier than raising money, and then this will always get pushed to the side. I'll call that person tomorrow. I'll apply for that grant tomorrow. I'll call that foundation tomorrow. You can always push it and kick that can down the road, so to speak, unless it's your job and you're being held accountable for that, whether it's by the board or the CEO or something like that. So that would be number one. Number two is you definitely have to have 110% of the board committed. I mean, it is not something, well, that would be nice. No. The board has to be completely on board with the CEO and the leadership team to say, we will not only support this vision, we will champion this vision. And so they have to go all in with their own personal donations. Right? They have to have some skin in the game. People want to see that the board is out in front and that they have made an investment. Don't make decisions and obligate my money if you're not involved in it either, right? And I would think even public schools could relate to that too, right? I mean, you want people to join your cause financially, well, then you better be out front leading the way. So your board has to be all in. You're going to have someone dedicated to fundraising. And the other thing I tell them too is don't plan for growth to pay for the capital campaign. Don't plan for growth to pay for the expansion. So, we'll go ahead and borrow millions of dollars, and then the influx of students or growth will pay for it over time. That's a risky game to play as well. And a lot of schools, including our own, 10, 20 years ago, we got caught in that trap too, where you think, I need it so badly right now that let's go out and borrow millions of dollars and eventually we'll be able to pay it off, like a home mortgage or something like that. You can do that to a small degree. That's no problem. But when you get into the millions of dollars with a capital campaign, and what if the economy goes south or we have a recession, then you're going to be stuck holding the bag, and you're going to be going to a lot of those customers and saying, hey, don't forget about that pledge you made. And they're going to say, I can't honor that pledge. I just lost my job, or we're moving out of Ohio. And so my $40,000, $50,000 pledge over 3 years is going to dry up. So you got to be careful. And those are some of the things that, really stick out to me in terms of advice that I give others when they're considering these things.
And you've seen all of those things happen. Like you said, you did a little bit of it. Yeah, those are real things. So there are we mentioned there's other leaders watching this podcast. We know that they're out there. And I know one of the reasons you do this podcast is to connect with those folks and help them. You also mentioned ASCI is asking you to speak on this topic. If people wanted to reach out to you, Si, and talk about their campaigns or their needs or things, I mean, you're willing to do that? And if so, how would they reach out to you and find you?
Yeah, absolutely. And as a matter of fact, I'm getting more and more calls in this regard. From people all over Ohio, especially because they probably know me the best as ACSI state representative, like you said, then also a group up there in Greater Cleveland I'm the president of, but I've got a lot of experience here and I'm happy to help. I'm doing a lot more coaching these days as well, one-on-one Zoom calls with CEOs of companies, especially, school superintendents or head of schools, school presidents that are launching this same kind of thing, and I'm happy to do that. I'm also doing more school board training now. I've got, I think, 2 schools signed up this summer that want me to come to their special, board retreat for 2 or 3 hours and really talk to them about this thing, because they are finding that their schools are standing room only, and they're going just like us. Hey, we were designed for kingdom impact and we've got to close our doors and we don't like it. But building is like, wow, we've never built anything before and we've never gone through an expansion, even if it's just a new wing. And yet it's going to cost $5 million. How in the world do we raise that? Or in our case, it's going to cost $30 million to do what we need to do. How in the world do we raise that? So I can come in and get you started on the right track and try to help you determine, are you ready to do some of these things? So certainly email smith.cy, and first name is spelled C-Y, smith.sci@mcsflames.org. That's certainly a great way to contact me. Or you can email me through the school's website at mcsflames.org. And again, MCS is Mansfield Christian School, mcsflames.org. Or again, you can even call the school at 419-756-5651, extension 200 will go to my assistant. So certainly email me directly, as I said, smith.sci@mcsflames.org or mcsflames.org on the school's website. But love to speak to you about something like that.
And we know, of course, also the clearlychristianeducation.com. You can reach out to you specifically.
That's
there
right.
where this podcast lives.
Yes.
I'm going to not ask any more questions, but I am going to promote. We do an extra credit episode of this show, and we're going to talk about your specific efforts in Mansfield with Mansfield Christian School along the same topic. So if folks want to look for that episode, we're going to dive a little deeper and maybe more personal and local into the conversation. But just as a quick teaser, and as your final comments before you kind of take over and wrap up the show, Si, what's your pitch in Mansfield? If you're talking to someone and if you had 30 seconds to say, look, man, I need this. I know that you're working on that. Why is it important to support Mansfield Christian School, and why is it important really for every leader can look at this and say, yeah, that would work in my community too? What's your pitch? And then I'll let you wrap up.
Right. Yeah, and I've said a little bit of this already, but this is really critical. I think where we're at as a culture, unless you've been living under a rock, you see where we're at, right? And you know it's not going to get better aside from a large number of people who make it better and move in a different direction and are proactive and live with conviction to say, this is where we need to go. And they're not going to do it unless they've had this training at their home, their church, and their school. All three of those legs of that stool have to work together in this culture in order to be successful. That's really what it's going to take. And we've been living too long on just home and church and thinking that's going to get it done. Look where we're at. It's not getting it done. People can't connect their rest of their life because they have no training in the rest of their life and these issues from a biblical worldview. That's what we do in Christian education. We can move the needle in a way that nobody else can. Well, again, thanks so much for listening. And now you know more. And when you know more, you can do more. You can not only think differently, but you can act differently, and you can make a change, live out those convictions, and say no more if you must. So again, thank you for joining me today on Clearly Christian. I trust again now you know more about Christian school funding and capital campaigns, and we continue to enjoy this conversation and hope that you'll follow along. Again, if you'd like to help us spread the word and you like the show today, let us know by following or subscribing. Hit that like button for me. That would let others know the show's worth checking out as well, and it certainly makes a difference, and I would very much appreciate that. Remember, the only way we're going to turn things around in our country is to increase the number of people who hold a biblical worldview. And the greatest hope we have to get there is Christian education. Again, for Clearly Christian, I'm Dr. Si Smith.
Thank you for listening to the Clearly Christian Podcast with Dr. Si Smith. Hear more episodes at clearlychristianeducation.com. If you'd like more information about Christian education in your neighborhood, or if you're interested in education opportunities at Mansfield Christian School, or if you agree with Dr. Smith and want to help him in his mission to influence and awaken Christian America, you can send Dr. Smith an email through the clearlychristianeducation.com website. Message him on the Clearly Christian LinkedIn or Facebook page, or call the Clearly Christian Connection line at 419-756-5651. This has been the Clearly Christian Podcast with Dr. Si Smith on clearlychristianeducation.com, brought to you in conjunction with Mansfield Christian School, a Bryan Media production.